The Gravedigger of the last vigil. It was a cold night, the kind where the wind seemed to scream amidst the silence of the deserted streets. The old São Lourenço cemetery was even more somber than usual, and there wasn't a living soul nearby, except for the gravedigger who had worked there for years. His name was João, but everyone called him Zé do Cemitério, Zé of the cemetery, as a way to ward off any memory of life. Not that it mattered to him. The cemetery was his home, and he knew every tomb, every headstone, every hole in the ground like the back of his hand. It was in the silence of the early morning, when everyone else was already asleep, that he felt most at ease. He liked that stillness, the smell of damp earth, the sound of rats scurrying among the graves, and especially the fear that seeped into the small cracks of darkness. That night, however, something was different. He felt it in the air, like an invisible pressure that made him look back with every step, even though he knew there was no one but him in that desolate cemetery. Zé do Cemitério, as he was known, was on his usual vigil, but something in his eyes burned with a deep weariness, as if the dead themselves were watching him. He held his shovel, the rusted blade reflecting faint light from the full moon, as he dug a new grave. He wasn't expecting anyone else that night. He shouldn't be. The body he had just buried hours earlier was already wrapped in the earth, and silence returned to reign, or at least it seemed to return. The trees swayed as if someone was among them, but there was no one. Suddenly, a scream, a muffled, anguished scream, coming from inside the cemetery. Zé stopped immediately, feeling a chill run down his spine. He had buried enough bodies to know that the dead didn't come back to scream. It wasn't another body being buried, it was something worse. Something he couldn't understand, but felt with every fiber of his being. He gripped the shovel tighter, as if that simple action could ward off the evil that was approaching. The wind intensified, and Zé felt as if something was watching him from the shadows. When he looked towards the entrance of the cemetery, he realized that the old iron gate was open. It shouldn't be open. He had closed all the gates at nightfall, as he always did. Something was wrong. The feeling of cold intensified as he approached the gate. The sound of his boots dragging on the dirt floor seemed louder and louder, breaking the silence that held the place. When he reached the entrance, a shiver ran down his body. There was something there, among the shadows, moving as if it were a presence, but at the same time, an absence. He felt his stomach tighten, and his breath became labored. A low, incomprehensible whisper came from the darkness, as if something was trying to talk to him, but he couldn't understand the words. Then, as in a nightmare, the figure appeared. It was a man, but at the same time, it wasn't. His eyes were black as night, without pupils, without life. The body seemed to be made of shadows, a thick mist that writhed unnaturally. The man was there, standing with a smile that seemed more like a threat than a sign of peace. Zé couldn't move. His feet were stuck to the ground, as if the earth itself held him there. He tried to scream, but his throat was dry. The shadowy man walked towards him with frightening slowness, each step echoing like a hammer pounding in Zé's chest. He felt the weight of that figure's presence, as if his soul was being pulled to a place of no return. When the being reached him, the words that had been whispered by the wind finally took shape. "You're next," the raspy voice said, and Zé didn't know if it was a real sound or just an illusion of the terror that gripped his mind. He tried to back away, but his feet didn't respond. He was trapped there, on the threshold between the world of the living and the dead. The man came even closer, his empty eyes fixed on Zé with an intensity that made his heart almost stop. He knew what was coming next. He had buried many souls, seen many bodies, but he had never felt anything like this. Something so evil and insane. The cemetery was not just a place for the dead, it was a prison, and Zé had just realized that he himself was one of the prisoners. As the shadowy being approached, he felt a pressure on his chest, as if he was being crushed by the darkness itself. And that's when he saw it. In the being's eyes, reflected what seemed to be his own face, distorted by pain and dread. He was the next victim. And what he felt now was not just fear, but the certainty that the end was near as the earth he himself had buried for so long. The shadowy man's smile seemed to widen even further, as if he was feeding on Zay's fear. A feeling of cutting cold enveloped the gravedigger, making him tremble uncontrollably. His mind was in a state of absolute panic. He wanted to scream, run, do anything to escape that nightmare, but something prevented him. It was as if the very earth beneath his feet was holding him there, as if the cemetery was a living being, an evil entity that devoured him from the inside out. Each breath Zay took seemed more difficult than the last, as if he was being suffocated by the very presence of the being approaching him. The shadowy man, still smiling, extended his hand towards the gravedigger, but his fingers didn't touch the flesh, as if he wasn't made of solid matter. Instead, the hand seemed to extend beyond reality, distorting the space around it as if it was part of something larger and much older, something that Zay couldn't understand. "You feel it, don't you?" the raspy voice whispered, now very close to his ears, making Zay feel a chill run down his spine. "The earth calls you. You're here to stay. Forever." The words pierced his mind like a sharp blade, and a sense of inevitability took hold of his being. The cemetery wasn't just a place where the dead rested, it was a place of transition, where souls found no rest, but were imprisoned in an eternal cycle, at the mercy of something much greater and crueler. Zay felt the truth of those words as if it were a curse, and his mind began to tangle, filled with distorted images of people he had already buried, faces that appeared and disappeared in the shadows, as if the souls of the dead were trying to communicate with him. But nothing made sense. Nothing made sense anymore. The shadowy man took a step forward, and the earth around Zay opened as if the ground itself was moving away, creating a deep fissure that led to the most absolute and immense abyss. From the bottom of the fissure, the gravedigger could hear the screams of lost souls, screams that seemed to come from ancient times, from eras when the cemetery was just an open field, a place forgotten by everyone except the dead. Zay tried to take a step back, but his feet were stuck, rooted in the earth, as if the cemetery itself was stealing his freedom. "There's no escape," the voice whispered again, this time with more urgency, more threat. "What has been buried here will never leave." The shadowy man was now right in front of Zay, and his eyes, or what was left of them, seemed to look directly into his soul. With each word that came out of the being's mouth, Zay felt a weight accumulating on his chest, an unbearable pressure. He wanted to fight, wanted to react, but something prevented him from doing anything other than watching, terrified. The cemetery around Zay seemed to transform. The trees, once motionless, now swayed violently, as if being shaken by an invisible force. The tombstones, which had previously been static and silent, began to emit a low sound, as if they were moving, rearranging themselves grotesquely. Zay looked at the graves around him and realized something even more terrifying. The tombstones were no longer engraved with the names of people he had buried. Instead, the names were his and those of each of the former gravediggers who had worked there before him. Each tomb now had an inscription with a name and a date that had not yet arrived, but which Zay knew with a fatal certainty referred to him. "The cycle never ends," said the shadowy man, his voice now echoing throughout the cemetery, as if it was coming from all directions at the same time. "You are a guardian now, a guardian of oblivion, a guardian of terror, and your vigil will never end." Zay felt a wave of dread consume his body. He wanted to wake up. He needed to wake up. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't do anything but watch that hell unfold before his eyes. The fissure in the ground widened even further, and the sound of the screams of the lost souls increased, taking over everything around him. The entire cemetery seemed to be crying, lamenting its eternal prison. That presence, that shadowy being, was not just any specter. He was the very guardian of death, someone who had been condemned to serve the cemetery forever. And now, Zay was his next victim. He was part of something much larger and more terrible than he could understand. The cemetery had chosen another soul to join those who roamed the tombs, those who would never find rest. The shadowy man raised his hand, and Zay finally felt the pain. The pain of his soul being torn from his body, the pain of his existence being erased. He was no longer in the cemetery. He was no longer in the cold and silent night. He was in a much worse place, a place where the dead never rest. And now he was part of it too. He was a guardian, condemned to watch over the souls of those who were trapped there until the moment another soul was chosen to take his place. And so the cycle of terror would continue, without end, without rest, without hope. The last thing Zay heard was the shadowy man's laughter, a laughter that echoed in the void as everything around him turned as black as the deepest night. The darkness that Zay now found himself in seemed to have stretched beyond his own comprehension. He no longer knew if he was alive or dead. His senses were distorted, as if his perception was being molded by an invisible force, something greater than him, which was not limited only to the cemetery, but to the entire territory of death and oblivion. He tried to scream, but he couldn't anymore. His mouth opened, but the sound was just an empty whisper that was lost in the thick air. The cemetery around him was now unrecognizable. The trees, those that once seemed like simple shadows in the night, were now distorted, with twisted trunks and black leaves that floated in the air for no apparent reason. The tombstones had become deformed monuments, with inscriptions that made no sense. The ground itself was moving, as if it were alive, pulsing with a macabre rhythm, as if the earth was breathing. Everywhere the wind whispered incomprehensible words, words that seemed to come from ancient times, words that spoke of an ancient curse, a curse that now took possession of Zay. "You can't escape, Zay." The hissing voice resonated again in his ears, making him shudder. The shadowy being was in front of him, now with his form completely distorted, floating in front of him like an entity composed of pure darkness. His face, or what was left of it, was now a vortex of shadows, the empty eyes watching Zay with an insatiable hunger. "You are part of all this now. The cemetery is your home. The souls of the dead, the wind that passes between the trees, the voices you hear, all this is you, all this is us." The creature took a step forward, and Zay felt a sharp pain in his chest, as if his own soul was being torn apart, torn from the depths of his being. The eyes of the black being shone with a faint, perverse light. "You have been chosen, Zay, and when the cycle is complete, another Gravedigger will come. But it will be too late. There will be no one to save you anymore. There is no going back to the world of the living. Now you are part of the darkness." Zay, or what was left of him, tried to scream, but his mouth was frozen. He felt as if he was being taken to a place beyond reason, where death and fear intertwined in a terrifying way. With each word uttered by the shadowy being, Zay felt more distant from everything he had known. His humanity, his essence, was being erased, consumed by the very earth he had sworn to protect. He became part of what he feared most, the very force that sustained the eternal terror of the cemetery. Suddenly the sound of the screams of the lost souls increased, as if a wave of dread had spread throughout the cemetery. Zay saw the graves opening again one by one with a supernatural violence. From the bottom of each of them, spectral figures began to emerge. Men and women with faces disfigured by pain, with torn clothes and lacerated bodies. They were trapped, just like Zay, trapped for eternity in that place, with empty eyes, but with an insatiable hunger for more souls to join them. "Look at them," the shadowy being whispered. "They are the other Gravediggers, the ones who came before you. They were doomed from the beginning just as you are. But you will understand soon, Zay. You will be the next to seek more souls, to wander without rest. You will be the guardian of death, the guardian of darkness." The bodies of the former Gravediggers began to move. They walked towards Zay with agonizing slowness, as if they were puppets controlled by invisible threads, pulled by the very curse of the cemetery. And as they approached, Zay felt the earth shake beneath his feet. The entire cemetery seemed to pulse like a living organism, feeding on the suffering and despair of the souls trapped there. Each step taken by the spectral figures seemed to echo like thunder, a promise that the cycle would never end, a promise that Zay would never be free again. He looked to the sides and realized that the ground was disintegrating under his feet, the earth beginning to open into fissures that stretched endlessly, revealing the deepest darkness where tortured souls crawled in eternal suffering. He was no longer standing, he was sinking. The darkness took over everything around him, and he felt that at any moment he would be swallowed by it, never to return. "We cannot escape this, Zay," a familiar voice, soft and desperate, whispered in the background. Zay, with an almost insane effort, tried to look towards where the sound was coming from. There, in the middle of the darkness, he saw a figure. It was someone he knew, someone he had buried a long time ago. It was the soul of his wife, Maria. "Maria!" Zay tried to scream, but the pain that dominated him prevented him from uttering a single word. You are also trapped here." She looked at him with empty eyes, an expression of pain stamped on her face. "You don't understand, Zay. What we did, what we all did, the cemetery, it calls us, but we cannot go. We cannot leave." She took a step forward, but was swallowed by the darkness before getting close. "Now it's your turn. You will be like us. You will be part of this forever." And then Zay saw everything. He saw all the other gravediggers, all the other dead, all the other prisoners of that cursed place, being dragged into the depths, into the endless abyss. He was just another in the eternal cycle, another soul lost in the clutches of darkness. And the last thing Zay heard was the laughter of that shadowy being echoing in the darkness as he sank into the earth, losing himself forever. The darkness that now enveloped Zay was no longer just the lack of light. It had become a viscous cloak that enveloped him, a dense substance that seemed to suffocate his thoughts, corrode his memory, and erase his identity. He no longer knew who he was. The name Zay seemed something distant, a fragmented memory that dissolved with each passing moment. He didn't know what was happening to him. He no longer knew what it meant to be alive. And above all, he didn't know if he was still among the living. The cemetery around him continued to transform, as if it were a living entity, pulsing with an evil energy. The tombstones, one by one, began to distort, their inscriptions now blurred, as if the very words had been erased by death itself. The twisted trees towered, their branches intertwining and creating a kind of ceiling that blocked all the light from the moon. The sound of the screams, increasingly intense, seemed to come from all sides, but Zay knew that there was no one else there besides him, and the souls that were trapped along with him. He looked to the sides, trying to find a way out, but the walls of darkness seemed to close, compress, as if the cemetery were a prison without walls, a parallel dimension where the rules of reality simply did not apply. The wind, once gentle, now carried with it a macabre melody, like an incessant lament, the song of something that Zay could not understand, but that he felt was deeply wrong. "You can't leave," the familiar voice whispered again. This time, it wasn't Maria's voice, but that of a man. Zay turned quickly and saw a familiar figure, the face of his former boss, the previous gravedigger, the one who had passed on the profession to him years ago. But something was strange. The figure was distorted, his eyes opaque, his body disfigured. He walked like a shadow, his feet lifting a thick mist that seemed to drag on like a fetid cloak. "I have also been where you are now," he said, his voice almost a whisper. "I have been trapped in this cycle for so long that I no longer remember when I was alive. The cemetery, it devours us slowly. It transforms us." Zay felt a lump in his throat. He wanted to ask what was happening, but his voice had disappeared. Those words, spoken by someone he knew, brought a slight relief, but also an indescribable dread. What he didn't understand yet was what exactly it meant to be part of the cemetery, as the shadowy being had said. How could that be possible? He had buried so many souls, but he had never imagined that he would end up being one of them. The previous gravedigger approached slowly, and his gaze, empty and distant, fixed on Zay with a deep sadness. The curse has no end, Zay. There is no solution. The cemetery is more than just a place of rest. It is a point of convergence, a space between worlds. The dead do not rest here. They are imprisoned. They become part of the place, just like us. The cemetery, it feeds on our pain, and it chooses who will be its new guardian. He paused as if he was processing something. Now it's your turn to get lost. Now you will learn what it means to be part of the darkness. Those words sounded like a hammer. Zay tried to understand, but his mind was obscured by pain and confusion. He could no longer think clearly. He wanted to flee, but the earth beneath him was firm, more solid than ever, as if it was attached to something beyond physics. He tried to move his feet, but he felt that the earth pulled them down, as if it was swallowing his legs, his joints. It was as if he was an extension of the earth itself, a piece of it that could never escape again. Gradually, he began to realize the true terror of what was happening. It wasn't just the cemetery that imprisoned him. He was the cemetery himself now. He was the graves, the tombstones, the wind, the silence, the pain of the lost souls. He was the essence of death that permeated that place. The cemetery possessed him, and the only thing he could still do was fulfill his destiny. An eternal vigil until another gravedigger was chosen to replace his soul. He looked at the sky, but he didn't see stars, just an immense darkness that seemed to stretch infinitely. The sky was no longer a limit, but an extension of the night itself, a night without end, without dawn. He heard once again the sound of the screams of the lost souls. They were everywhere, dragging themselves in the shadows, but their eyes were fixed on Zay. They were familiar faces, but their expressions were distorted by pain. They were those he had buried over the years. They were there, but they weren't dead. They were part of the place now. "Can you see, Zay? They never left," the previous gravedigger said, now with a weak laugh that echoed through the trees. "They are like us. They are in every stone, in every root, in every leaf. They no longer know what it is to live. They don't know what it is to rest." Zay tried to scream, but again his voice was absent. He tried to run, but his legs were immobilized, his hands trapped, as if the very tombs held him. He was no longer a person, but a shadow, a vague memory of who he once was. The cemetery was now him, and he was the cemetery. Suddenly, the shadowy being appeared again, floating before Zay. His smile widened to a point that seemed almost monstrous. "You understand now, Zay? There is no escape. There is no salvation. All those who pass through here are marked, and you were marked, like all the other gravediggers before you." Udrome, the earth trembled once more, and from one of the oldest graves in the cemetery, a huge hand covered by moss and earth emerged, followed by a decrepit body, half rotten, but with supernatural strength. The body, now completely upright, looked directly at Zay with empty eyes, but full of a frightening urgency. From his lips, a voice resonated like an echo coming from somewhere very distant. "He's here. He has already arrived." Zay looked at the creature, and a feeling of indescribable terror overcame him. He felt the presence of something even older, something even more powerful than the cemetery, an entity that was waiting, watching, and that now manifested itself through those who were dead. Death was not the end, it was just a door to something even more terrifying. The body approached Zay, and the earth beneath his feet began to crack, revealing a dark abyss, bottomless, endless. And Zay felt that he was being pulled, not only into the physical abyss, but into the very heart of death. He became part of it, and the cycle began again. The last thing he heard was the sound of the earth swallowing everything, the laughter of the shadowy being, the lament of the lost souls, and the sound of another grave being opened.